Can you guess what emotion we're showing with our faces or our actions?
Number 1. Happiness. Disgust. Fear. Disappointment. That was a tricky one. It was interest. Okay, here's our last one. Confusion. Ready? If you're watching this video with someone else, we can add another element to this game. Sit so one person is looking at the screen and the other person is looking away from the screen, but can still see their partner's face. We will put a word on the screen, and the person who can see the word has to act out that emotion for the other person to guess. Hi! Welcome to episode 10 of the Children's Fireside Storytime Chat, hosted by the Sheboygan County Historical Society and Museum. I am Angie Hullen, the education program developer at the museum, and these are my helpers, my son Jory, my son Adlai, and their helpers Turkey and Blue Jay.
Hi! Hi!
Today we're going to be talking about stories and storytelling. The word history has the word story in it. In some languages, history and story are actually the same word.
Like in Spanish, historia means history, but it can also mean story.
That's right. And in German, the word Geschichte means history, but it is also how you say story. We learn history from the stories told by people who lived before us. Those stories might be happy, sad, funny, interesting, surprising, scary, or confusing. Many stories are a combination of many of those traits. Today's story was written in a book called Jim's Brother by Richard Dykstra. Richard lives in Sheboygan County, and he wrote about his memories of growing up here in the 1950s and 1960s. The story we're going to read is called The Lady Stuck in the Mud. It's a funny story, but it can also teach us some interesting ways that growing up at that time was similar to and different from growing up now. And as we read this story, we'll be showing illustrations that were done by volunteer artists from throughout the county. It's a fun way to collaborate to tell a story using a new method. The Lady Stuck in the Mud by Richard Dykstra. For the first 87 years of its existence, Liberty School had no running water and no indoor plumbing. During that time, students got their drinking water from a cheese factory across the road, and used either of two outhouses that flanked the rear of the school building. By 1955, a furnace room and two indoor bathrooms had been added onto the rear of Liberty School. The building project was initiated in an effort to keep the school open. At that time, the most backward one-room schools were the first to close. With a brand new furnace and indoor plumbing, it was hoped that Liberty School would be spared. The new addition to our school included a room large enough for students to play indoors during inclement weather. A large refrigerator freezer stood in the northeast corner of the room. The refrigerator allowed students to have fresh whole milk on a daily basis. The milk was delivered to Liberty School twice weekly by a small family-owned dairy. The only outside entrance to Liberty School's rear addition was on the south side of the building. When the delivery person brought milk to our school, she backed her car along the south side of the old school building until she reached the entrance to the addition. She then carried several milk crates from the trunk of her car into the addition, placed the milk in the refrigerator, and carried crates of empty bottles back to her car. All of this was typically done without disturbing classes that were being conducted in the adjacent room. East Central Wisconsin had a very wet spring in 1961. Several late spring storms blanketed the countryside with wet, heavy snow. When the weather warmed, melting snow created standing water everywhere. One day that spring, the milk lady's car became mired in mud as she backed the vehicle along the old portion of our school. The milk lady completed her delivery and tried to leave, but her car wouldn't budge. At that point, she came into our classroom and asked the teacher if some of the older boys in school could assist in freeing her car. Kurt Hesslink, David Termott, and I were excused from class and went outside to help the milk lady with her predicament. We didn't help her out of her predicament. We helped her with the predicament. As we exited the school building, we realized that the longer the milk lady's car was stuck in the mud, the longer we could stay out of school. With that in mind, we did everything possible to make sure the car stayed mired in the mud. Eventually, the milk lady thought of putting some boards under the rear tires of her car and freed the car by herself. Even then, she thought that we were helping by pushing the car at the appropriate time. The three of us managed to stay out of school for 20 or 30 minutes, and we felt very proud of our accomplishment. The milk lady went on her merry way, and we figured that was the end of the story. Much to our surprise, she showed up at school the very next day, a day without a scheduled delivery. To our greater surprise, she brought several ice cream treats for each of the nice boys who helped free her car from the mud. We graciously accepted the gifts and kept perfectly silent about our actions. I'm sure we did this primarily to keep the milk lady from becoming disillusioned, but it also helped preserve our sparkling image. So, as we can see, no matter when they are growing up, kids will be kids. Richard and his friends were in school to learn, but they also wanted to have fun. Do you ever find ways to get out of doing some of your schoolwork or lessons sometimes?
No.
Do you?
No.
Some of the things in the story that we noticed were different from today were that the milk was delivered to the school directly from the dairy. These days, school milk and lunches are delivered through a massive system of farmers, processors, packagers, and delivery people. Was there anything else that you noticed that was different?
Outhouses!
Outhouses. In the beginning of the story, Mr. Dykstra mentioned that before Liberty School got their new addition, students would go to the bathroom in the two outhouses outside of the school. If you're interested in seeing an outhouse in person, there are a few places you can still go in the county to see some historic outhouses.
But be aware, they're not in use anymore.
If you're interested in seeing a real historic outhouse, you can come to the museum at 3110 Erie Avenue. And we have, as part of our historic building collection, an actual outhouse that was in use up until the 1930s. And if you ask someone at the desk, they can even open it up and show you what's inside. Another place in Sheboygan County where you can go and see a historic outhouse is at Heritage School, right by Longfellow Elementary School. Another thing you might have noticed is that we had different illustrations of two different schoolhouses. The artist who drew the two schoolhouses is named Ken Bailey. He wanted to draw both the Liberty Schoolhouse, which was part of the story we read, and also a schoolhouse he knew from Rangeley, Colorado, which was the hometown where Mr. Bailey grew up. Ken told me his own story of why that schoolhouse was special to him. It was built in 1913, and the whole building was moved around the town of Rangeley to 5 different locations. He said something about that schoolhouse that I found fascinating and beautiful. He said, "The elderly 1913 schoolhouse, moving here and there more times than many people do in their lifetime, has become to me like a mascot of the town's history and character, never giving up, always going with the flow and reinventing itself to adapt to change, as change comes, as change always must." Do you have a building near where you live that you find interesting or inspiring? Maybe when you grow up, you will tell younger generations about a certain building or place that was special to you. We were lucky to be able to interview Richard Dykstra, the author of The Lady Stuck in the Mud, earlier this month, and we would like to play some parts of that interview for you now. Today is Wednesday, August 12th, and we are at the home of author Richard Dykstra, interviewing him about his writing process. Jory, what is your first question?
Did you write stories when you were a child?
Actually, when I was a child and we would have a snow day, my brother and sister and I would make newspapers to have something to do. We'd make pretend newspapers. So that's about all the writing I did, though. When I was a child, I was more interested in science, and actually worked as an engineer for 40 years. Writing was a hobby, but I enjoyed it.
How did you decide to become an author?
When I did the writing for technical materials, it was because I worked for a company that was part of large organizations that contributed to reducing engine noise, and I was told by the people I worked for that I should write something. So that's really how I started writing those things. The first book that I wrote, which is Jim's Brother, actually I wrote after both my parents passed away, and there were so many things I wished I had asked them. So my mother was an only child, but my dad came from a family of 10 children. So I went to my dad's siblings and asked more about how he was raised so I could understand how I was raised. And then I wrote this book initially, not as a book, it just was some stories, but I wrote it so my children would understand how I grew up, so they would have a better idea of why I raised them, or my wife and I, actually my wife more, raised them.
How did you decide what stories to tell in your book?
Well, that's part of my writing process. Actually, I am not a reader, which is kind of unusual, probably for an author. But I went to school in the 1950s to a one-room school, and they didn't do much with if people had reading disabilities or something else. And the reason I was probably interested in science is because I was such a poor reader. So I didn't do well at those classes, but I did well at math and science. So I never thought I would write anything, but I read a book by a man from Iowa. His name was Mr. Heinen. It was spelled differently than the Heinens around here. But he wrote like 2 or 3 page stories, and I read that book, and I thought, wow, that's a good way to do it. So I thought I would do the same thing with Jim's Brother. And what I did was, before I wrote a single story, I made a list of all the stories that I could remember, and then I crossed out the ones that I didn't think people would have as much interest in, and then eventually wrote the others.
What did you hope people would learn from your story?
Well, what the thing that I wanted and actually happened was how many people were reminded of their childhood when they read these stories. When I grew up, I went to a school that only had 12 students in all 8 grades. There were 2 in my class. There were some grades that had no students. So at that time, almost everybody lived on farms. Wisconsin was much more rural. In fact, there was a farm every quarter mile. There'd be another farm. That's so different than it is today. Now the farms are much bigger, but at that time, a lot of people had small family farms. And I just thought that these stories were some of the ones that would bring back memories of the.
Is there anything else you would like to share with viewers?
I would encourage every parent to document their life story for their families. I think it's a great thing, and in fact, several of my grandchildren have, or our grandchildren, have interviewed my wife, Linda, and myself for school projects to ask some questions about how it was when we grew up, and it was different. It's amazing. One thing that surprises a lot of people, I went to a one-room school. For the first 3 years, we didn't even have indoor plumbing. We had to use outhouses. And in 1961, my parents let me stay home from school to watch the first American astronaut go into space. And a lot of people are really, really surprised that we still had one-room schools in Wisconsin while we already had astronauts in space. So there are things I think people might be a little surprised at how long these schools functioned and how well they functioned. And if you're looking at the building, if you can see on the, may I please? Do you mind? On the left side, the back part of the school was only used for 5 years. It was built in the mid-50s to try to keep the school open. That's when we added bathrooms and an indoor furnace. And that's where we had the refrigerator that kept the milk that the milk lady would bring. And she would come into school and she would back up along that side to the door along the back. And in 1961, we had a lot of late snowstorms and the ground got really muddy. And that is where the lady stuck in the mud story came from.
The book Jim's Brother, along with Richard Dykstra's other books, are on sale at both the Sheboygan County Historical Museum in Sheboygan and the Sheboygan County Historical Research Center in Sheboygan Falls. I would encourage you to check out those books. There are a lot of interesting stories, and in some cases, stories that made us laugh out loud. We would like to give a big thanks to Mr. Dykstra for allowing us to read his story, as well as welcoming us to his backyard to give us an interview. Special thanks also to all of the artists who contributed their artwork to help illustrate The Lady Stuck in the Mud. Question for you guys. What was your favorite part of the story, The Lady Stuck in the Mud?
Ice cream.
Ice cream. Ice cream is on a lot of our minds because it is the end of summer and it's such a great cool treat on a hot day. If you want to play some ice cream games, we have a couple of ideas for you that you can do with fake ice cream. We used cotton balls. Some of the ideas we had for some ice cream fun would be to do a blindfold challenge. See how many cotton balls you can get in the bowl while you're blindfolded or have your eyes closed. You almost got it, Adlai.
Or out of the bowl.
Or out of the bowl, sure. Adlai, what was your idea?
Do a relay race.
You could do a relay race with cotton balls on a spoon or an ice cream scoop. And see how many you can get across a set distance. What was your idea, Jory?
Bang.
See if you can slingshot them into the bowl. See how many you can get in a minute or 30 seconds. Think of all sorts of fun things you could do with some fake ice cream.
Post them in the comments, too.
And post them in the comments.